Woman pregnant for 10 years gives birth to living dinosaurs. How did this happen? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. It was a sweltering July morning in the heart of suburban Ohio, and the air inside St. Mary's Medical Center was thick with anticipation. The case had drawn national attention. A woman pregnant for a decade. Every corridor of the hospital buzzed with journalists, medical professionals, and the curious public who had gathered outside, their cameras flashing in rapid succession every time a new detail emerged. Inside the sterile, brightly lit delivery room, however, the atmosphere was anything but calm. Dr. Evelyn Mathers, a seasoned obstetrician with over 2 decades of experience, stood frozen, her hands trembling slightly as she stared at the ultrasound monitor. The image on the screen was unlike anything she had ever seen. Beside her, a younger resident, Dr. Liam Carter, leaned in, his expression oscillating between confusion and awe. "This can't be right," Evelyn whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the machines. "The scans, they show bone density inconsistent with any known fetal development. And the scales?" She paused, running a hand through her silver-streaked hair. "What in the world is this?" The patient, 38-year-old Madeline James, lay on the delivery bed, her face pale and etched with a combination of exhaustion and fear. She had endured years of ridicule and disbelief, dismissed by doctors who chalked her prolonged pregnancy up to rare medical anomalies or even psychological conditions. Yet, through it all, she had insisted something was different. Something was growing inside her that defied explanation. "I've been telling you," Madeline said weakly, her voice cracking from hours of labor. "I've known all along this wasn't normal. But no one believed me." Her husband, Greg, stood at her side, clutching her hand tightly. His rugged face betrayed the countless sleepless nights he had spent trying to protect his wife from the relentless media circus and skeptical professionals. Dr. Mathers turned to the rest of the medical team. "We proceed with caution. This isn't just an unprecedented case, it's something else entirely. Everyone stay sharp." As the labor progressed, Madeline's contractions intensified. The delivery room filled with the controlled chaos of medical equipment beeping, nurses moving swiftly between stations, and the occasional muffled instructions from Dr. Mathers. Despite the tension, there was an unspoken agreement among the team. Whatever was about to happen would rewrite medical history. Outside the hospital, the crowd had swelled to include protesters, religious groups declaring the event a sign of the end times, and conspiracy theorists with signs reading, "Alien hybrid confirmed" and "Science has gone too far." News anchors jostled for the best angles as helicopters hovered overhead, their cameras capturing every second of the unfolding drama. Back in the room, Madeline let out a guttural cry, her body convulsing with the force of another contraction. Dr. Carter moved closer, his gloved hands ready to assist, but what he saw made him stumble backward, nearly knocking over a tray of instruments. "Dr. Mathers, you need to see this," he stammered, his face ashen. Evelyn approached cautiously, her heart pounding. As she peered closer, her eyes widened in disbelief. Emerging slowly was not a typical newborn, but something covered in what appeared to be translucent scales. Tiny, sharp claws pressed against the membrane that still enclosed the being. The room fell silent, save for the persistent beeping of the heart monitor. "It's hatching," someone whispered. Madeline's breaths came in shallow gasps as she looked at the medical staff. "What is it? What's happening?" she pleaded, her grip tightening on Greg's hand. Before anyone could respond, the membrane tore with a faint, wet sound, revealing a creature unlike anything seen before. It was small, no larger than a human infant, but its features were unmistakably reptilian, scaly skin that shimmered under the harsh fluorescent lights, tiny, serrated teeth, and a tail that coiled tightly around its body. The creature blinked up at the room with luminous, amber eyes. The team stood paralyzed, torn between their medical training and the sheer impossibility of what they were witnessing. Finally, Dr. Mathers found her voice. "Get the NICU team in here now. We need to assess whatever this is." But before anyone could move, the creature let out a piercing screech, its tiny body writhing. It was a sound that sent chills down every spine in the room, a primal, ancient cry that seemed to echo through time itself. Greg stepped forward instinctively, his protective instincts overriding his fear. Is it alive? Is it healthy? Dr. Mathers nodded slowly, her professional demeanor cracking under the weight of the moment. It's alive, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But this is beyond anything we've ever encountered. As the team scrambled to stabilize the newborn, or hatchling, Madeline's body convulsed again. There's another one, she gasped, her eyes wide with a mix of terror and determination. The room erupted into motion once more as the medical staff prepared for what was shaping up to be a delivery unlike any other. Meanwhile, outside the hospital, the crowd grew increasingly restless as rumors spread like wildfire. "They've delivered something," a reporter said breathlessly into her microphone. "We don't have confirmation yet, but eyewitnesses describe strange noises coming from inside." The scene here is electric. Inside, the second creature began to emerge, its features eerily similar to the first but slightly larger, its scales a deeper shade of green. This one came out more aggressively, its claws gripping the edge of the delivery table as it let out a low growl. Dr. Mathers and her team worked feverishly, their training barely preparing them for the biological enigma before them. But it was Madeline who broke the silence, her voice trembling but resolute. "I told you," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I told you it wasn't human." The room fell silent again as her words sank in. Whatever had been born that day was not merely a medical anomaly, it was something much, much more. The delivery room at St. Mary's Medical Center had transformed into something straight out of a science fiction movie. The staff, still reeling from the shock of the first hatchling, worked with wide-eyed determination to ensure the second creature's safe delivery. The tension was palpable as Madeline let out another guttural scream, her body convulsing with the effort. The second hatchling, larger and more robust than the first, emerged with a startling ferocity. Its sharp claws clicked against the metal surface of the delivery bed as it stretched its sinewy neck, letting out a low, guttural hiss that reverberated through the room. Its scales glistened under the fluorescent lights, a deep emerald green that seemed almost otherworldly. Dr. Evelyn Mathers, the team's seasoned obstetrician, took a cautious step forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "We need containment units immediately," she ordered, her voice firm despite the whirlwind of emotions coursing through her. "These creatures are unpredictable, and we can't risk them getting loose." Dr. Liam Carter, her young and eager assistant, scrambled to follow her instructions, his hands shaking as he set up an improvised containment unit, a large, transparent incubator typically used for premature infants. But as he reached for the second hatchling, it whipped its tail with surprising speed and force, knocking the tray of instruments to the floor with a deafening crash. The room froze. The creature let out another hiss, its piercing amber eyes scanning the humans around it with a predatory awareness that sent chills down everyone's spine. Greg, Madeline's husband, stepped forward instinctively, placing himself between the creature and his wife. "Stay away from her," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. His protective instincts had taken over, even in the face of something so utterly incomprehensible. "It's okay," Madeline whispered weakly, her voice barely audible. "They won't hurt us." "I can feel it." Evelyn exchanged a skeptical glance with Liam. "Madeline, we don't know what these creatures are capable of," she said cautiously. "We need to treat this situation as a potential biohazard until we understand more." But Madeline shook her head, her pale face resolute. "They're mine," she said firmly. "I've carried them for 10 years. I know they won't harm me, or Greg." The medical team hesitated, their professional instincts clashing with the surreal reality before them. Finally, Evelyn nodded. "Fine," she said, her voice laced with reluctance. "But we're keeping a close watch on them." As the staff worked to secure the hatchlings in the makeshift containment units, Madeline's body convulsed again. "There's another one," she gasped, her eyes wide with a mix of terror and exhaustion. Evelyn's stomach dropped. "A third?" This defied all known medical and biological understanding. She motioned for the team to prepare for yet another delivery, her mind racing with questions that had no immediate answers. The third hatchling emerged with a dramatic flourish, its scales a shimmering gold that seemed to catch and reflect the light in mesmerizing patterns. It was smaller than the second but more agile, its movements quick and deliberate. Unlike its siblings, it made no sound, its piercing blue eyes scanning the room with an unnerving intelligence. 3, Liam muttered under his breath, his voice tinged with disbelief. 3 of them? What does this mean? Evelyn didn't respond. Her focus was on stabilizing Madeline, whose body was visibly weakened from the ordeal. We need to stop the bleeding and monitor her vitals, she said, snapping into action. Madeline, you've done an incredible job. But we need to focus on your recovery now. Madeline nodded weakly, her eyes drifting to the 3 hatchlings. Despite her exhaustion, a faint smile played on her lips. They're beautiful, she murmured. Greg squeezed her hand tightly, his own emotions a chaotic mix of awe, fear, and overwhelming love for his wife. You're amazing, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Meanwhile, the hatchlings had settled into their respective containment units, their behaviors as distinct as their appearances. The first, with its translucent scales, seemed curious, its amber eyes following every movement in the room. The second, with its emerald green scales, was more aggressive, testing the boundaries of its enclosure with sharp claws and a flicking tail. The third, the golden one, remained eerily silent, its gaze locked onto Madeline as if it recognized her as its mother. Outside the hospital, the crowd had reached a fever pitch. News of that unprecedented birth had spread like wildfire, drawing even larger crowds of protesters, conspiracy theorists, and curious onlookers. Police struggled to maintain order as chants and debates filled the air. God's wrath is upon us, shouted one protester, holding a sign that read, "Repent now." This is the dawn of a new era, countered a conspiracy theorist, his tinfoil hat glinting in the sunlight. The government's been hiding this technology for decades. Inside, the atmosphere was no less chaotic. The hospital's administration, caught off guard by the sheer magnitude of the situation, scrambled to handle the media frenzy. Reporters demanded answers, their questions growing more pointed and accusatory by the minute. "What are these creatures?" one journalist shouted as hospital security ushered her out of the building. "Are they dangerous? Are they even from Earth?" Back in the delivery room, Evelyn took a deep breath, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of what had just transpired. "We need to involve specialists," she said finally, turning to Liam. "This is beyond our scope. Paleontologists, geneticists, maybe even military experts. Whatever this is, it's bigger than us." Liam nodded, his face pale but determined. "I'll make the calls," he said, stepping out of the room. As the door swung shut behind him, Evelyn turned back to Madeline and Greg. "We're going to do everything we can to protect you and your children," she said, choosing her words carefully. "But you need to prepare yourselves. This is going to change everything." Madeline nodded, her gaze fixed on the 3 hatchlings. "It already has," she said softly. And deep down, Evelyn knew she was right. The tension in the hospital escalated as the reality of the situation began to sink in. The 3 hatchlings were like nothing anyone had ever seen or even imagined. Security in the maternity wing was heightened, with armed guards stationed at every entrance. The staff whispered in hushed tones, their eyes darting nervously toward the delivery room as they speculated about the implications of this unprecedented event. Madeline lay in her hospital bed, her body recovering but her mind unable to rest. She couldn't stop thinking about the hatchlings, her children. Despite their reptilian appearances, she felt an unshakable bond with them, a connection that defied logic. She glanced at Greg, who sat beside her, his hands clasped tightly around hers. "They're ours," she said softly, her voice trembling with a mix of wonder and fear. "I don't care what they look like. They're our babies." Greg nodded, his jaw tightening. "I know," he said, though his voice carried the weight of uncertainty. "But, Madeline, what does this mean for us? For them? How are we supposed to protect them from all of this?" He gestured vaguely toward the door, where the muffled sounds of chaos from outside the hospital could still be heard. Madeline didn't have an answer. She only knew that she would do whatever it took to keep them safe. Meanwhile, in a sterile conference room down the hall, Dr. Evelyn Mathers convened an emergency meeting with hospital administrators and a hastily assembled team of specialists. Paleontologist Dr. Samuel Grayson, who had been rushed in from a nearby university, sat at the table, his face a mixture of disbelief and fascination as he flipped through photographs of the hatchlings. This is impossible," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "These creatures resemble theropod dinosaurs, specifically velociraptors. But that's absurd. Dinosaurs have been extinct for over 65 million years. There's no way these creatures could exist, let alone be born to a human mother. And yet, here we are," Evelyn replied curtly. "Dr. Grayson, we need answers. How is this possible? Could this be some sort of genetic anomaly? A mutation?" Grayson shook his head. "Even the most extreme genetic mutations wouldn't result in something like this," he said. "This isn't a natural occurrence. If I had to guess, I'd say this is the result of some kind of genetic engineering. But even that would require technology far beyond anything we currently possess." "Are you suggesting that these creatures were designed?" asked one of the administrators, her voice tinged with alarm. Grayson hesitated. "I'm saying it's a possibility," he said. "But without more data, I can't say for certain." Evelyn rubbed her temples, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. "We don't have time for theories," she said. "We need a plan. The media is already in a frenzy, and the public is demanding answers. We have to figure out how to contain this situation before it spirals out of control." As the meeting continued, tensions flared and tempers frayed. Some argued for immediate government intervention, while others warned against involving authorities who might prioritize containment over care. In the end, they agreed to keep the hatchlings under close observation while continuing to investigate their origins. Back in the delivery room, the hatchlings remained in their containment units, their behaviors as enigmatic as ever. The golden one, smaller and more agile than its siblings, seemed to be the most observant. It often tilted its head as if studying the humans around it, its piercing blue eyes filled with an intelligence that was almost unsettling. The emerald green one, by contrast, was restless and aggressive, frequently testing the boundaries of its enclosure with sharp claws and sudden lunges. The translucent scaled hatchling, the first to be born, appeared the most curious, pressing its snout against the glass as it followed the movements of anyone who entered the room. Greg couldn't take his eyes off them. Despite their alien appearances, there was something undeniably captivating about them. "They're incredible," he murmured, his voice filled with awe. "I've never seen anything so alive." Madeline managed a weak smile. "They're more than incredible," she said. "They're ours." But not everyone shared their sense of wonder. Outside the hospital, the protests had grown louder and more volatile. Conspiracy theories ran rampant, with some accusing the hospital of harboring extraterrestrial life forms, while others claimed it was part of a government experiment gone wrong. Religious groups clashed with scientists, each offering their own interpretations of what the hatchlings represented. Inside, the staff struggled to maintain a semblance of normalcy amid the chaos. Nurses whispered about resigning, and some even refused to enter the maternity wing, citing fears for their safety. Security was doubled yet again, with orders to allow no one near the hatchlings without explicit authorization. Dr. Liam Carter, who had been tasked with monitoring the creatures, approached Madeline and Greg cautiously. "We've noticed something unusual," he said, his voice hesitant. "The golden one. It seems to respond to your voice, Madeline. When you speak, its movements change. It becomes calmer, more focused." Madeline looked at him, her brow furrowing. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that these creatures recognize you," Liam replied. "Not just as their mother, but as someone they trust. We don't fully understand it, but there's a connection here, one that goes beyond biology." Greg's grip on Madeline's hand tightened. "So what does that mean?" he asked. "Are they dangerous?" Liam hesitated. "We don't know yet," he admitted. "But what we do know is that they're highly intelligent. Possibly more intelligent than any animal we've ever encountered. And that makes them unpredictable." Madeline took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. "Then we'll just have to show them that they can trust us," she said. "They're not monsters, Dr. Carter. They're our children. And we're going to protect them, no matter what? As Liam left the room, his expression conflicted. Madeline and Greg turned their attention back to the hatchlings. For all the uncertainty and fear surrounding them, one thing was clear: their lives would never be the same again. The morning light streamed through the hospital windows, casting a surreal glow on the chaos that had engulfed the maternity wing. The hatchlings, now more active, had begun vocalizing, a series of chirps, growls, and almost melodic tones that seemed to resonate with each other. It was clear they were communicating, though the purpose of their sounds remained a mystery. Madeline woke to the sound of the golden hatchling tapping its claws against the glass of its enclosure. It wasn't frantic like its green sibling or curious like the translucent one. It was rhythmic, deliberate, almost as though it was trying to convey something. She sat up, her gaze meeting the hatchling's piercing blue eyes. "It's trying to talk to you," Greg whispered from the chair where he'd been keeping vigil. His face was drawn from exhaustion, but his eyes held a spark of fascination. Madeline approached the enclosure cautiously, her hand resting on the cool surface of the glass. The golden hatchling pressed its snout to the same spot, emitting a soft chirp that sent a shiver down her spine. She spoke to it in a soothing tone, her voice trembling slightly. "What are you trying to tell me?" she murmured. The hatchling chirped again, tilting its head as if considering her words. Greg watched in awe. "It's responding to you, Madeline," he said. "It knows you're its mother." Before she could reply, the door to the room burst open, and Dr. Evelyn Mathers stormed in, flanked by 2 armed security guards. Her expression was grim, her movements purposeful. "We need to move them," Evelyn announced, her voice clipped. "The hospital isn't equipped to handle this level of scrutiny or the potential risks these creatures pose. A secure facility is being prepared where they can be studied safely." Madeline's heart sank. "You're taking them away?" she asked, her voice rising with panic. "You can't do that. They're my babies." Evelyn's gaze softened, but only slightly. "Madeline, I understand how you feel," she said. "But this isn't just about you. These creatures are a scientific anomaly, possibly the most significant discovery in human history. They need to be studied, for their safety and ours." Greg stepped forward, his voice firm. "You can't just take them without our consent," he said. "They're not some lab experiment, they're our children." Evelyn sighed, her patience clearly wearing thin. "This isn't up for debate," she said. "A transport team will be here within the hour. I suggest you say your goodbyes." Madeline's mind raced, her body trembling with a mix of fear and anger. She couldn't let them take her babies away, but what could she do? The security presence in the hospital was overwhelming, and she and Greg were outnumbered and outmatched. As Evelyn left the room, Greg turned to Madeline, his jaw clenched. "We can't let them do this," he said. "There has to be another way." Madeline nodded, her resolve hardening. "We'll find a way," she said. "But we have to be smart about it." Meanwhile, in the observation room, Dr. Liam Carter and Dr. Samuel Grayson were closely monitoring the hatchlings. Liam had grown increasingly uneasy about the hospital's decision to remove them from Madeline's care. He had seen firsthand the bond she shared with them, and he feared what might happen if that bond was broken. "They're not just animals," Liam said to Grayson. "They're intelligent. They're aware. Separating them from their mother could have catastrophic consequences." Grayson nodded, his brow furrowed. "I agree," he said. "But the decision isn't ours to make. The powers that be have already decided their fate." Liam hesitated, then lowered his voice. "What if we intervened?" he suggested. "What if we helped Madeline and Greg keep them safe?" Grayson looked at him in surprise. "You're talking about going against orders," he said. "That's career suicide." "Maybe," Liam admitted. "But I became a doctor to help people, and right now, the people who need our help the most are in that room." Grayson considered his words, then nodded slowly. "If we're going to do this, we need a plan," he said. "And we need to move quickly." As the hour ticked by, the hospital buzzed with activity. The transport team arrived, their equipment sleek and intimidating. They moved with precision, their faces impassive as they prepared to remove the hatchlings from their enclosures. But when they entered the delivery room, they were met with an unexpected sight. The enclosures were empty. The hatchlings were gone. The lead officer turned to Madeline and Greg, his expression suspicious. "Where are they?" he demanded. Madeline feigned confusion, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I don't know," she said. "They were here earlier." The officer narrowed his eyes, but before he could press further, an alarm blared through the hospital. The lights flickered, and chaos erupted as staff and patients scrambled to understand what was happening. In the confusion, Liam and Grayson worked quickly to move the hatchlings to a safe location. They had hidden them in an unused storage room, where they now worked to secure them in makeshift carriers. The golden hatchling chirped softly, its gaze fixed on Liam as if understanding what he was doing. "Let's hope this works," Grayson muttered as they prepared to sneak the hatchlings out of the hospital. Back in the delivery room, Madeline and Greg held their breath as the officers searched the area, their frustration mounting. Evelyn arrived, her expression thunderous. "Find them," she barked. They couldn't have gone far. As the search continued, Madeline and Greg exchanged a glance. They didn't know where Liam and Grayson had taken the hatchlings, but they trusted that the doctors were doing what was best for their family. For the first time since the ordeal began, Madeline felt a glimmer of hope. The hatchlings were safe, for now. But she knew the fight was far from over. The hospital was a maze of chaos as alarms blared, staff scrambled, and the transport team's frustration turned into palpable tension. Security guards fanned out, systematically checking rooms, hallways, and any possible exit points for the missing hatchlings. Madeline and Greg, still in their hospital room, exchanged tense glances as the search intensified around them. Dr. Evelyn Mathers stormed into the room again, her face a mask of fury. "This is not a game," she barked at the couple. "Where are they?" Madeline, trying to remain calm, met Evelyn's piercing gaze. "We don't know," she said firmly, her voice steady. "And even if we did, do you really think we'd hand them over to you? They're not your property, they're our children." Greg stepped forward, his voice cold. "You've treated this like a science experiment from the beginning," he said. "You don't care about them, you care about your career, your reputation, and your headlines." Evelyn's mouth tightened, but before she could respond, her radio crackled. One of the security guards' voices came through, tense and clipped. "We've got a lead. The storage wing, North Corridor." Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "Stay here," she ordered the security guards in the room before storming out, barking commands into her radio as she went. As soon as the door closed behind her, Madeline turned to Greg. "We can't just wait here," she whispered. "They're going to find them." Greg nodded, already moving to the door. "We need to find Liam and Grayson," he said. "They're the only ones we can trust." Meanwhile, in the dimly lit storage room, Dr. Liam Carter and Dr. Samuel Grayson worked quickly to secure the hatchlings. Each one was placed in a padded carrier designed for transporting small animals. Hardly ideal for creatures of their size and strength, but it was the best they could do under the circumstances. The golden hatchling, as always, remained eerily calm, its piercing blue eyes fixed on Liam. The green hatchling, however, was far less cooperative, thrashing and growling as Grayson struggled to secure it. The translucent hatchling, smaller and more delicate, clung to the edge of its enclosure, its movements hesitant and fearful. Liam crouched down, speaking softly to the golden hatchling. "We're going to get you out of here," he said. "But you need to trust us, okay?" The hatchling chirped softly in response, and Liam felt a surge of determination. He had no idea where they would take the hatchlings or how they would keep them safe, but he knew they couldn't stay in the hospital. The sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway snapped him out of his thoughts. Grayson froze, his face pale. "They're coming," he whispered. Liam nodded, his mind racing. "We need a distraction," he said. "Something to buy us time." Grayson glanced around the room, his eyes landing on a stack of oxygen tanks in the corner. "That'll do," he said, moving quickly to tip them over. The resulting crash was deafening, and the hissing sound of escaping gas added to the confusion. In the hallway, the security guards paused, their attention drawn to the noise. Evelyn barked orders into her radio, directing some of the guards to investigate while the rest continued their search. Back in the storage room, Liam and Grayson used the distraction to slip out a back door, the hatchlings safely secured in their carriers. They moved quickly and quietly, sticking to the less traveled hallways as they made their way toward the parking garage. Madeline and Greg, meanwhile, had managed to slip away from their room and were also heading toward the parking garage, guided by their intuition and the faint hope that they would find Liam and Grayson there. As the two groups converged, the tension was almost unbearable. Every shadow seemed to hold the threat of discovery, every sound a potential alarm. But finally, in a secluded corner of the garage, they found each other. Liam's face lit up with relief when he saw Madeline and Greg. "We've got them," he said, gesturing to the carriers. "But we don't have much time. They'll figure out where we went soon enough." Madeline rushed to the carriers, her eyes welling up with tears as she checked on the hatchlings. The golden one chirped softly, pressing its snout against the mesh of its carrier as if to reassure her. "We need to get out of here," Grayson said urgently. "I have a friend with a private lab upstate. It's secure and he's trustworthy. He can help us figure out what to do next." Greg hesitated. "A lab?" he asked. "How do we know it'll be any different from here?" Liam placed a hand on his shoulder. "I trust this guy," he said. "He's not like Evelyn. He's a good man. A scientist, yes, but also a father. He'll understand." Madeline nodded, her mind made up. "Let's go," she said. "We'll figure the rest out later." As they loaded the carriers into a waiting van, the sound of shouting echoed through the garage. Evelyn and her team had found them. "Go!" Liam shouted, slamming the van's door shut. He and Grayson climbed into the front seats, while Madeline and Greg crouched in the back, shielding the carriers with their bodies. The van roared to life, its tires screeching as it sped out of the garage. Behind them, Evelyn's team gave chase, their vehicles close on the van's tail. The chase through the city streets was harrowing, the van weaving through traffic as Liam tried to lose their pursuers. Madeline clung to the carriers, her heart pounding as the hatchlings chirped and growled in fear. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the outskirts of the city. Liam took a sharp turn onto a dirt road, the van's tires kicking up clouds of dust as they sped toward the dense forest ahead. Evelyn's team hesitated at the turn, their vehicles slowing as they debated whether to follow. The dirt road was narrow and treacherous, and they knew the risks of pursuing the van into the unknown. In the end, they decided against it, turning back toward the city with a mixture of frustration and resignation. In the van, the atmosphere was tense but relieved. They had escaped, for now. But Madeline knew this was only the beginning. The fight to protect her children was far from over. The van jolted and rattled as it sped down the uneven dirt road, the canopy of trees overhead creating a shield from the distant city lights. The forest enveloped them, and for a moment, it felt as though they were escaping not just Evelyn and her team, but the chaotic world that had erupted around them. Madeline kept her hands on the carriers, whispering soothing words to the hatchlings as they chirped nervously. The golden one seemed the most composed, its piercing blue eyes watching her intently, as though understanding her every word. The green one let out occasional growls, its fiery temperament undiminished even in its confined space, while the translucent hatchling remained curled into itself, trembling softly. Greg broke the silence in the van, his voice a mix of exhaustion and worry. "Where exactly are we headed, Liam? And how long until we get there?" Liam, gripping the steering wheel tightly, glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "We're heading to Dr. Colin Novak's property. It's a private research station about 2 hours from here, deep in the forest. No one knows it exists, it's off the grid." "Novak?" Madeline asked, her voice skeptical. "Can we trust him? How do we know he won't turn this into another Evelyn situation?" Grayson turned in his seat to address her directly. "Colin is different. He left the academic world years ago because he didn't agree with how science was being weaponized for profit. He works with endangered species now, helping to rehabilitate them and reintroduce them into the wild. If anyone can help us keep these hatchlings safe, it's him." Madeline nodded slowly, her instincts telling her to trust Grayson. "All right," she said. "But if he shows even the slightest sign of betrayal—" "He won't," Liam interrupted, his tone firm. "Colin is on our side." The forest road seemed endless, and the tension in the van was palpable. Every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves outside felt like it could be the sound of Evelyn's team closing in. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, the oppressive silence of the chase began to lift, replaced by the ambient noises of the forest. Greg tried to lighten the mood, though his attempt was feeble. "So," he said, glancing at the golden hatchling. "Anyone else feel like we've stepped into a science fiction movie?" Madeline managed a faint smile, though her heart was still heavy. "If this were a movie," she said, "we'd at least have a script to follow. Right now, we're just making it up as we go." The van eventually slowed as Liam turned onto an even narrower path, the trees closing in around them. After a few more minutes of careful navigation, the headlights illuminated a small, unassuming cabin nestled among the trees. Beyond it, a series of outbuildings and fenced enclosures hinted at the station's true purpose. Liam parked the van and turned to face the group. "We're here," he said. "Let's move quickly." They unloaded the carriers and made their way to the cabin, where a tall, bearded man with kind eyes and a weathered face was waiting for them. He stepped forward, his gaze taking in the group with curiosity and concern. "Liam," he said, his voice warm but serious. "You've got some explaining to do." "This is Dr. Colin Novak," Liam said, introducing him to the group. "Colin, this is Madeline, Greg, and their children." Colin's eyebrows shot up in surprise, but he said nothing as Liam unzipped one of the carriers, revealing the golden hatchling. The creature blinked up at him, its blue eyes shimmering in the dim light. Colin crouched down, his expression a mixture of awe and disbelief. What are they?" he asked softly. Madeline stepped forward, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "They're ours," she said, "and they're in danger. We need your help to keep them safe." Colin stood, his face thoughtful. "Come inside," he said. "We can talk more there." The cabin's interior was cozy but functional, with shelves lined with books and jars, a large wooden table in the center, and a fireplace crackling softly in the corner. Colin gestured for them to sit while he retrieved a stack of blankets and a medical kit. As he examined the hatchlings, his gentle touch and soothing voice seemed to calm them. The golden one remained still, its gaze fixed on him with an intensity that made Madeline's heart ache. The green one squirmed but eventually settled, while the translucent one clung to Madeline's hand, its small body trembling. "They're extraordinary," Colin said, his voice filled with wonder. "But they're also fragile. The translucent one especially, it's struggling." Madeline nodded, her throat tight. "Can you help them?" she asked. Colin hesitated, his expression serious. "I'll do everything I can," he said, "but I'll need to run some tests to understand their needs. Their physiology is unlike anything I've ever seen." Greg frowned. "Tests?" he asked, his tone wary. "That's not what we agreed to." Colin raised his hands in a gesture of reassurance. "Nothing invasive," he said. "I promise. Just basic observations, diet, temperature, behavior. They're in a critical stage right now, and we need to act quickly." Madeline looked at Greg, her eyes pleading. "We don't have a choice," she said. "If we don't figure out how to care for them, they won't survive." Greg sighed but nodded, his trust in Madeline outweighing his doubts. "All right," he said. "But we stay with them the whole time?" Colin nodded. "Of course," he said. "I'll set up a temporary enclosure for them in the lab. It's secure, and they'll have everything they need." As they moved the hatchlings into the lab, the weight of the day began to settle on them. Madeline watched as Colin carefully set up heat lamps and feeding stations, his movements deliberate and precise. For the first time in days, she felt a flicker of hope. They were far from safe, and the road ahead was uncertain, but for now, they were together. And that, she realized, was all that mattered. The lab was a stark contrast to the cozy warmth of Colin's cabin. Bright lights illuminated the clean, sterile environment, with rows of high-tech equipment lining the walls. Despite the clinical atmosphere, Colin worked with a gentleness that reassured Madeline, Greg, and even the hatchlings. The golden one seemed particularly curious, its head darting back and forth as it took in the unfamiliar surroundings. Colin set up 3 separate enclosures for the hatchlings, each tailored to their unique needs. Heat lamps provided warmth, while small pools of water allowed the translucent hatchling to submerge itself. For the green one, he included a climbing structure, sensing its need for physical activity, while the golden one's space was kept open, reflecting its calm yet observant demeanor. Madeline stayed close, her eyes never leaving the hatchlings. "They've been through so much," she said softly. "I just want them to have a chance." Colin glanced at her, his expression kind. "We'll give them that chance," he said. "But we need to be prepared. If Evelyn and her team find us, they won't stop until they have them." Greg paced nervously near the doorway, his arms crossed. "What's the plan if they do find us?" he asked. "We can't keep running forever." Colin straightened, his demeanor shifting from calm researcher to determined protector. "I have a network of contacts," he said. "People who specialize in moving endangered species to safe locations. If it comes to it, we can get the hatchlings out of here and into a sanctuary where they'll be safe." Madeline frowned. "But what about us?" she asked. "We can't just hand them over and walk away." "You won't have to," Colin assured her. "We'll figure out a way to stay connected. But their safety has to come first." As the group discussed their options, the hatchlings began to explore their enclosures. The green one tested its climbing structure, leaping from branch to branch with surprising agility. The translucent one paddled nervously in its pool, its delicate movements stirring ripples in the water. The golden one, however, remained still, its piercing blue eyes locked on Colin. Colin noticed the golden hatchling's intense gaze and crouched down to its level. "You're the leader, aren't you?" he murmured, a faint smile playing on his lips. "You're the one holding them together." Madeline watched the interaction, her chest tightening. There was something profoundly intelligent about the golden hatchling, something that set it apart from the others. It wasn't just a creature, it was a being with thoughts and emotions, and she could feel its connection to her. The peaceful moment was shattered by the sudden blare of an alarm. Colin shot to his feet, his face pale. "They found us," he said, his voice grim. Greg swore under his breath, his hand instinctively reaching for the door. "What do we do?" he demanded. Colin moved quickly, shutting off the alarm and activating the lab's security system. Steel shutters descended over the windows, and the main door locked with a heavy thud. "We hold them off as long as we can," he said. "Madeline, Greg, stay with the hatchlings. Liam, help me secure the perimeter." Liam nodded and followed Colin out of the lab, leaving Madeline and Greg alone with the hatchlings. The translucent one let out a frightened squeak, pressing itself against the side of its enclosure, while the green one hissed and clawed at the bars. The golden one, however, remained calm, its eyes scanning the room as though assessing the situation. Madeline knelt by its enclosure, her voice steady despite the fear gripping her heart. "It's going to be okay," she whispered. "We're not going to let anything happen to you." Outside, the sound of vehicles approaching grew louder, accompanied by the unmistakable hum of a helicopter overhead. Evelyn's team had arrived, and they weren't holding back. Liam and Colin worked frantically to fortify the cabin, but the odds were stacked against them. Greg paced the lab, his mind racing. "We can't just sit here," he said. "If they break through, we're trapped." Madeline looked at him, her eyes fierce. "We're not leaving them," she said firmly. "If we run, they'll take the hatchlings. We have to fight." Greg hesitated, torn between his instinct to protect Madeline and his fear of what they were up against. "What do you have in mind?" he asked. Before Madeline could answer, the golden hatchling let out a low, rumbling growl. It stood tall in its enclosure, its wings spreading slightly as its blue eyes glowed with an intensity that sent chills down her spine. The green one and the translucent one stilled, their attention focused entirely on the golden hatchling. "They're communicating," Madeline realized, her voice barely above a whisper. "The golden one, it's telling them what to do." Greg stared at the hatchlings, his skepticism fading as he watched their synchronized movements. "What are they planning?" he asked. Madeline's heart raced as the golden hatchling let out a sharp cry, its voice echoing through the lab. The other two responded in kind, their cries harmonizing in a way that sent vibrations through the floor. The sound was otherworldly, a haunting melody that seemed to resonate with the very walls around them. The lab's lights flickered, and for a brief moment, everything was still. Then, with a deafening crash, the steel shutters buckled, and Evelyn's team stormed the cabin. The front door burst open as Evelyn's team stormed the cabin, armed and determined. Their presence was overwhelming, with black-clad figures pouring in like a tidal wave. Colin and Liam, crouched behind a barricade of overturned furniture, exchanged a tense glance. The sound of boots against the wooden floor echoed through the space, underscoring the urgency of the moment. "Hold your ground," Colin shouted, his voice steady despite the chaos. He gripped a makeshift weapon, a fire extinguisher, while Liam prepared to use a chair leg as a club. Neither was equipped for a full-blown raid, but their resolve was unshaken. In the lab, Madeline and Greg braced themselves. The golden hatchling emitted another commanding cry, its wings now fully unfurled. Its eyes glowed with an eerie brilliance, and the other two hatchlings responded, their behavior shifting from fear to focus. The green one clawed at its enclosure, the translucent one churned the water in its pool, and together they created an energy that seemed to pulsate through the room. Madeline knelt next to the golden one, her voice trembling but determined. "If you're trying to help us," she whispered, "we're with you." Greg stood by the door, clutching a steel rod he had found in the corner of the lab. His knuckles whitened as the noise outside grew louder. "What's the plan, Madeline?" he asked, his voice laced with urgency. "Because they're not going to stop." Before she could respond, a sharp, high-pitched sound filled the air. It wasn't coming from the intruders but from the hatchlings. The golden one led the charge, its cry piercing and commanding, while the green and translucent hatchlings harmonized in an otherworldly chorus. The sound seemed to ripple through the building, shaking the walls and causing the intruders to hesitate. Evelyn, standing at the entrance of the cabin, froze. She clutched her earpiece, shouting commands, but her team faltered. "What is that sound?" one of them muttered, their weapon trembling in their hands. Colin took advantage of the momentary distraction. He sprang from his hiding place, spraying the fire extinguisher into the group. The white cloud engulfed them, causing confusion and chaos. Liam followed suit, swinging his improvised weapon to knock an intruder's weapon out of their hands. "Fall back," Evelyn ordered, but her team was already in disarray. The sound from the lab intensified, and the golden hatchling's cry grew louder, more focused. It wasn't just noise, it was a force, an energy that seemed to seep into the minds of everyone in the building. Madeline felt it too. The vibrations coursed through her, filling her with a strange mix of fear and awe. The golden hatchling locked eyes with her, and she understood. "They're protecting us," she whispered. "They're trying to stop them." Greg looked at her, his skepticism replaced by a glimmer of hope. "You think they can hold them off?" he asked. Madeline nodded. "I don't know how, but I believe they can." The intruders began to retreat, their movements disjointed and uncoordinated. Some clutched their heads, their faces contorted in pain, while others dropped their weapons entirely. Evelyn's voice rose above the commotion, demanding order, but it was clear she was losing control. In the lab, the golden hatchling's glow intensified. It pressed against the bars of its enclosure, its wings straining as if trying to break free. Madeline hesitated for only a moment before opening the latch. The golden one stepped out, its presence commanding. It stood tall, its wings shimmering in the dim light, and let out a final, powerful cry. The green and translucent hatchlings followed suit, their combined energy creating a shockwave that rippled through the cabin. Evelyn staggered back, her composure shattered. "Fall back," she screamed, retreating toward the door. Her team followed, their fear palpable. Within moments, the cabin was empty, save for Colin, Liam, Madeline, Greg, and the hatchlings. The golden one turned to Madeline, its piercing blue eyes meeting hers. There was a depth to its gaze, a sense of understanding that went beyond words. She reached out, her hand trembling, and touched its head. The glow around it softened, and for a brief moment, everything was still. Colin entered the lab, his face a mix of exhaustion and relief. "They're gone," he said. "For now." Madeline looked at the golden one, then back at Colin. "They saved us," she said. "They're more than we ever imagined." Greg nodded, his earlier doubts replaced by a deep respect for the creatures. "We can't let them fall into the wrong hands," he said. "They're too important." Colin placed a hand on Madeline's shoulder. "We won't let that happen," he said. But we need to move. Evelyn will be back, and next time, she won't hold back. As the group prepared to leave, the golden hatchling let out a soft, almost melodic chirp. The other two responded, their cries blending into a harmonious sound that filled the room with a sense of hope. Madeline smiled, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and determination. They're not just creatures, she said. They're our family now. With that, the group gathered their belongings and prepared for the journey ahead. The hatchlings, each in their own way, seemed ready for whatever came next. Together, they would face the challenges ahead, united by a bond that transcended fear, doubt, and even species.